to be too specific with details here, but I'm sure you'll understand why I'm wise to being a bit paranoid by the end of this. I've been into urban exploring, or URBEX as people are calling it these days, for just as long as I can remember. I think it all stems from being an extreme introvert. How when other kids were playing together on jungle gyms and swing sets, I preferred being off my own, exploring some hidden corner of the park or wherever we were. By the time I was a teenager, I was cracking bigger and bigger targets, traveling across town on my bike on weekends to tag derelicts with a can of spray paint. Then in my 20s, I was traveling across the Northeast to hit up some classics, as well as some lesser-known derps that hadn't been scouted out all that well. But I definitely had 2 or 3 haunts in my hometown I'd hit up once or twice a year, just to see how they were progressing, so to speak. It's more like degressing, actually, but you get my point. Buildings would accumulate filth, become home to animals, maybe people. You'd get graffiti artists coming in and out. It was nice seeing them age. Of all the places I'd thought I'd come closest to losing my life, it definitely wasn't in my local toads. I knew them like the back of my hand, and they were my favorite because they were relatively safe. But anyway, on with the story. I'm wandering around this big old industrial complex, marveling at how Mother Nature seemed to be slowly taking it back, one cracked paving slab at a time. I stopped to eat some sandwiches I'd packed with me, sitting up in the office of an old factory that looked over the shop floor. All the glass was smashed out, and I'm just sitting in the filthy old chair trying to eat as cleanly as possible when I suddenly begin to hear voices. At first, I start to worry, thinking it might be security or even the cops. I didn't think the place had any active cameras, or that I'd been spotted by anyone on duty, so I'm kinda angry at myself for slipping, at least until I hear the voices getting louder and louder. They didn't sound like cops at all, but they were definitely headed into the building that I was in. The only question was, what were they doing there? But unfortunately for me, it wasn't long before I found out. This isn't exactly what they said, just a close approximation from memory, but here it goes. Guy 1. I'm telling you, man, this is bad news. They got him with 12 keys and he's gonna roll on us. Guy 2. We can get him county, that's not the problem. It's the names he drops between now and then, the ones that can get back to us. Guy 1. But do we even know who he's named? We can't just rub out 6 guys assuming they're all gonna turn states. Guy 2. We don't have a choice. Guy 3. He's right. There are almost $500,000 at stake here. We can't afford to take chances. Everyone has to go. Guy 1. Wait. You gotta be kidding me. We're gonna rub out 6 of our own guys? Guy 3. You heard what I said. Get it done. Anyone who knows, get it done. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Some kind of murderous criminal conspiracy, possibly over drugs or other illegal imports, and it was going down just meters away from me. Now try to think of the worst thing that could possibly happen at that point. Outside of the world getting hit by an asteroid, what's the one thing you wouldn't want to happen in that situation? For those of you that answered, my phone suddenly going off, then ding ding ding, right answer. Because right as these guys were about to leave, I got a call. I didn't even see who it was. I just mashed the lower volume button to silence the ringtone, then heard, "Who's that? Who's there?" before the sound of running. I ran harder and faster than I ever had in my life. And if it wasn't for the fact that I knew the place like the back of my hand, I might not be here telling you all this today. I was so scared that I didn't even go home that night. I just went to another of my favorite toads and hung out there until morning, only leaving when I was certain that I wasn't being followed. In retrospect, I don't think they saw my face or anything, and they probably thought I was an undercover narc or something, I don't know. But nothing ever came of the incident, and I had no idea who the guys were to be able to follow their case in the news or whatever. It was definitely the scariest thing that's ever happened to me while urbexing though, and it's taught me to, overall, expect the unexpected. I've been exploring all kinds of places on and off for a long time now. In buildings with structurally questionable stairs or floors, you learn very quickly to tread carefully. Mainly how to distribute your weight over a wider area so you're less likely to go right through some rotten old floor. I've seen a guy fall right through a floor he thought was solid, thanks to some random leak leaving a patch of moldering timber. His night ended in the back of an ambulance with a huge wood splinter in his leg. EMTs said if we'd pulled it out, he'd have bled to death there and then. Then there's the tunnels, catacombs, anywhere underground where you can get what we call bad air. This is when you get spots of concentrated CO2 in underground places with bad ventilation, and it's super easy to just blunder into the places where you suddenly start feeling out of breath. And in places you're unfamiliar with or places that are particularly dark, that can be fatal. It's not even the lack of air either. It's the fear response that's elicited from being exposed to high concentrations of carbon dioxide that cause people to panic and get lost. Then by the time they get their bearings, it's too late. I've only ever had this happen to one of the crew I used to crack derps with, and thankfully, I wasn't there to witness it. But he said he just felt all lightheaded all of a sudden, and then the next thing he knows, he's waking up outside in the dirt with his crew almost crying with relief. Another gas-related hazard is H2S. Hydrogen sulfide sort of isn't as bad as CO2 because you can smell it, and therefore get a warning, but it's arguably just as dangerous. It's caused by rotting organic matter in places there isn't much oxygen, so like anywhere underground or underwater like swamps. Smelling that telltale rotten egg smell means there's a good chance that something has died in your derp, and if you do smell it, you need to turn around and get out of there, like pronto. Because H2S is highly toxic. So toxic that in higher concentrations, you don't get that rotten egg smell, because it's burning out the receptors in your nostrils. So, if you're urbexing and you smell rotten egg, then you don't smell rotten egg, it might be because you're literally dying. The H2S attacks your eyes, then your lungs, then your central nervous system. You collapse, then you drown in your own lung fluid. Horrible way to go. And thankfully I don't personally know anyone who's been exposed to it, but it legit kills people every so often. Just Google it to check out the incidents. Another less common hazard, but one you still gotta keep in mind, is the biohazard side of things. You get these empty houses, especially in places like Detroit, where the same mortgage brokers foreclosing on houses suddenly collapse, so there are these total ghost houses that almost look like the people went on vacation and just never came home. There can also be all kinds of rotten food and all the bugs and bacteria that comes with it. Abandoned farmland can have dead farm animals too, and once I stumbled across the corpse of a cow, one that had become so bloated in death that it had exploded. It had corpse flies landing on me before I knew where they'd came from, and after that, you can bet that I brought hand sanitizer with me on every run that followed. Obviously, there are all the security and police hazards in play, but they're not the things that scare me. Most you're going to pick up is a trespassing charge, and that's if the cops ever get involved at all. It's surprisingly easy to get out of situations if you just treat the guards like human beings. Explain why you're there, that you don't mean any harm, and most of the time they'll just escort you off-site with a warning. Same with the cops. Just be honest, explain it's a hobby, and don't carry anything they can arrest you for, and most you'll get is a slap on the wrist. As for the first few things I brought up, take them seriously. URBEX is super fun, but it's a lot more fun when no one gets hurt. So please take care and look after each other out there. I used to be into urban exploration in a big way, and growing up in Detroit after the crash meant I had no shortage of places to crack. I knew URBEX could be dangerous. Some might tell you that's part of the appeal, but my derp days end with a visit to the old Packard plant. Now, a little background. The Packard plant is an automobile factory that shut down way back in the 50s. but it was still being used as a general storage facility until the late 90s when business began to die out. Then finally, I think it was in like '09 or '10, and the last remaining businesses threw in the towel, and the site became officially and completely abandoned. I heard of a few all-night raves being held there for a while, but then as the years went by and disrepair made the place more of a hazard than an adult playground, people stopped using it for underground parties. That's when the place became the kingdom of just two kinds of people: meth heads looking for any leftover copper wiring, and urban explorers such as myself. Since the Packard plant was right on our doorstep, we put it off for a while, figuring we could crack it whenever we wanted. But when we finally did, it proved to be a huge mistake. Right away, we knew something was up when we started to smell this strong chemical smell coming from somewhere on site. But it wasn't like it was the first time we'd been somewhere that smelled gross, and nothing had managed to turn us back before, so we pushed on. Obviously, we were looking for the best hero shot, as we call it, which is somewhere we can get the best photograph of ourselves exploring the ruins. So we're scouring the plant while weighing up our options. That's when we came across all these big old storage warehouses, and it was there that the stink seemed to increase like tenfold. It was so pungent that I felt like the insides of my nostrils were burning, and when we checked the last warehouse, we found the culprit. This huge pile of chemical drums had just been dumped in the middle of the barren space, and the concrete around it was drenched in what had to be the source of the smell. I took a few photos, intending to anonymously email them to whatever environmental protection agency wanted to deal with it. Then when I turned to show them to my buddy, he gives me this weird look. "Dude, your nose." I knew what he was referring to before I even put a hand in my face, as I suddenly felt something warm and wet dripping over my lips. A nosebleed. The freaking chemicals in the air were intense enough to give me a nosebleed. We just got out of there, and I felt kind of terrible for the next 24 hours, but I couldn't exactly afford to go see a doctor, so I just kind of forgot about it. I had no idea how bad it was until a few of us were driving to get dinner one night and my buddy farted in the car on the way back. Everyone but me is acting like he just pooped out a dead raccoon or something, but I'm sitting there in the back like, what are you guys talking about? It's not even that bad. A few more incidents like that actually prompted me to pony up for a doctor's appointment. And what do you know? I'd lost 70% of my olfactory senses, which is medical speak for my sense of smell. The doctor said that, judging from the damage done, compared to the length that we'd been exposed, about an hour more on site and I'd have been coughing up blood. The other guys had complaints in the days that followed, but nothing like I had. I'm just lucky, I guess. It sucks, but it doesn't really affect me too much in my day-to-day life. I can still smell stuff, it's just not as intense. And the silver lining was the pictures we took caused a small-scale scandal in the EPA over toxic waste dumping, forcing the city to actually do something about it so it wouldn't happen to anyone else. The point is, do yourself a favor, folks. If you're out doing URBEX, always bring respiratory protection. Back when I was about 14 or 15, me and two friends of mine were exploring the forest that surrounds our city. We are from Belarus, and our city was basically carved out of the forest during the time of the Tsar. It was also the center of some very heavy fighting during the Great Patriotic War, or World War II to everyone else. So there are parts of the forest that are home to old bunkers, trenches, and even abandoned weapons and vehicles. Most of the more dangerous items have been removed over the years, but there are still plenty for us to explore and loot. But as time went on and our little adventures ate up more and more of the forest, we were forced to go deeper and deeper into the woods in order to get our exploration fix. That's how we found the old military barracks, and unlike many of the other places we found, we never, ever went back to the barracks again. It began when we came across a rather steep hill. The trees were growing in a way that meant you could grab hold of the roots in order to pull yourself up, and we were very excited because we hadn't been that deep into the forest before. The steep slope became something of a natural boundary for us, and passing it was something of a milestone. We scaled the hill, walked through the trees for about an hour, and then there they were. A collection of large, run-down buildings that were in the process of being reclaimed by nature. In the past, it had only been the odd pillbox or roughly dug trench that betrayed the bloody conflict the area had once seen. But to see some old Soviet military complexes was very exciting. It took us a while to pluck up the courage to finally wander into the big dark buildings, but when we did, we soon grew more comfortable and began to split up to further explore the barracks. I remember digging through an old footlocker but finding nothing of note, as the barracks must have been stripped and abandoned long, long ago. Then out of nowhere, heavy footfalls had me spinning around to see my friend moving quickly through the barracks towards me. I asked him if he was okay, only to see that he had this nervous expression on his face. That's when he says, "I don't think we're alone here." You have to understand, my friend was always doing things like that, pranking me in all kinds of ways before laughing how scared I got. I told him to shove his practical jokes up his backside, but he insisted. "I swear to God, I think I saw someone in the other building there." Again, I was about to tell him to pull the other one and that I was too old to fall for his ghost stories anymore. But I was silenced by what was undoubtedly a man's scream. It was loud, very loud, and it was close too. It was a scream that sounded more like one of terror than one of pain, and the sound of it caused all the hairs on our necks and arms to raise before we ran out of the barracks and through the woods. I'd never ran like that before, and I've never ran like that since. It amazes me how strong and how much stamina the body gets when fear enters the equation. That and how haphazardly we treated things that we had much respect for previously. Like the big hill, before we had treated it with reverence, but in fear, we practically slid down the thing in seconds, getting scratched by roots and covered in dirt in the process. We had no idea if whoever screamed was following us, but we were also in no mood to look back and find out. We didn't actually stop running until we could see the buildings of our city again, and even then, I almost vomited from all the exertion. We never found out who was back there, as we didn't return for many, many years, and by that time it was deserted. But we think it was some kind of vagrant who was living there and simply wanted to scare us off by pretending to be a specter or something. Well, it worked. I know that much. And it made for the scariest experience I've ever had while exploring the area around my hometown. As much as you hear a lot of "I found an old skeleton" or "the place I cracked was haunted," that's not actually anything to be afraid of. Not unless you're a dope who believes in ghosts. Whereas me and my buddies found something genuinely frightening and genuinely dangerous that might have actually killed us. And it came in the form of an iron lung. We cracked this old sanitarium a while back, and getting up onto the roof made for some incredible hero shots. But then this one room we bust in, and immediately one of us is like, "Out, out, out, don't breathe, just out." She also happened to be the most experienced, so we listened, and good God, it was a good thing we had her with us, because if not, I'd have been all over those things trying to figure out what in God's name it was. She's referring to these big old steel drum-looking things that turned out to be something called an iron lung. But she recognized that not only did those things used to treat patients with tuberculosis, one of the gnarliest diseases ever, but that the germs that cause the disease can survive for years in places they're concentrated. After that, we just got out of there. Didn't even bother to hit up the morgue to see if we could get any cool shots, because as much as those shots and untouched derps are important to us, nothing is more important than safety. So please, if you ever do URBEX, do your research, people, and always bring along a more experienced explorer, if possible. I grew up near this old housing estate that was due for demolition. When I was still a single-digit age, people still lived there, but as I got to about 14, people were moved out to other estates and the place was basically just abandoned. Yet, this only opened it up for curious teenagers to explore, and we carved out a series of little sit-offs, as we called them, in each abandoned building. Those consisted of maybe 1 or 2 rooms where me and my mates would chill, get drunk, smoke up, whatever mischief was the order of the day. It also provided us with a place to go whenever our parents got a bit too much for us, nothing the average teenager doesn't go through. It was just nice to have somewhere to escape to, even if that place didn't consist of rust, splinters, and broken bits of just about everything. So, one morning, we're on our way to school when we spot the local cash and carry bloke emptying his boot of some new stock. Then boom, as we're walking past and he walks inside, we see the 6-packs of Fosters he's got underneath the big wholesale bags of crisps. Then, in one fell swoop, swiped. We each had 6 cans in our grip and were legging it away from the shop. We were so fast that the bloke didn't even notice us. I mean, he definitely knew it was missing, but to him, about 12 cans of lager just disappeared in a poof of smoke. Trouble was, there was no way we'd be able to go to school with our bags full of beers. We'd be found out, and so I volunteered to run down to the abandoned housing estate, stash the beers in one of our littlest dens. Then, we could just go back later that day and pick them up. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. So, I told my mates to tell our teacher that my dad had a breakdown or something, then went to drop off the booze at our little stash. Cut to the end of the school day at about 3:30 p.m. and we're headed down to the abandoned flats to grab our stolen loot. It's just me and this lad Chris who went to grab it all, while we agreed to meet the others on this big sports field that we used to hang out on. We'd have all just gone to the stash, but it was a sunny day, so we were in no mood to just sit in some old dusty derelict. So, as we walked into the flats, you had this big long corridor where all the doors had been busted in, and our stash was one of the last ones on the corridor. So we're walking past all these old flats when my mate stops dead, and I turn to see what stopped him, and he just points into one of the flats. A little bit of light was getting in the dirty windows, just enough to see that a noose was hanging from a support beam. An actual noose, made out of electrical wire, and it's just hanging there, like it's waiting for someone. All it took was a little bit of noise coming from down the corridor, and we're legging it out of there, totally beerless. Needless to say, our desire for underage drinking trumped our fear, and we ended up heading back inside, albeit very, very cautiously. It was totally silent, and we half expected to go back in to see a body hanging from the noose, but when we reached the room again, it was actually gone. Trying to stay as quiet as we could, we grabbed the beers and snuck out again, and either there wasn't anyone around or the owner of the noose was hiding because we didn't see anything as we left. Obviously, the first thing we did when we got down to the field was telling everyone what we'd seen, but they just dismissed it as us trying to make up scary stories or something. I remember me and Chris kind of laughing like, okay, whatever, don't believe us, we know what we saw. And the takeaway was us just feeling annoyed and amused that they didn't believe us. But that only meant that it took a while for what we'd seen to actually sink in. Someone had been looking on topping themselves, and in a way, we'd stopped it. Or at least, just delayed it. We never found out who it was either. None of us heard anything about anyone being found dead or anything like that, so I'd like to think that we helped that person reevaluate their situation, and fingers crossed, they decided against it in the end. But still, I sometimes worry that we didn't help as much as we thought we did, and that someone else was unlucky enough to discover someone hanging, when we'd be so close to those unlucky people being us. Years ago, I used to visit this abandoned nursing home not far from my parents' house. It was set into quite a large old complex with rundown buildings, porta potties, and security shacks dotting the area. I'd mostly just explore it, enjoying the peace and quiet that was impossible to achieve in a house with 4 young brothers and sisters. It was every bit as relaxing by comparison as you might imagine. Only, there were 2 parts of the old nursing home that used to really creep me out. The first was the infirmary. The other was like a children's area. I know, I'll explain soon. The infirmary was creepy for obvious reasons, given that it gave off some serious Silent Hill vibes. But there was also all these old x-rays scattered around the place, and almost every single one of them was a patient's head. You could see all their teeth and even their brains and stuff. It was really freaky thinking that each one of them had belonged to an actual person who probably wasn't with us anymore. I wouldn't say the place was haunted. I don't really believe in that sort of stuff, but it was definitely the closest feeling to having ghosts in the room with you. The other place that used to creep me out was the children's area. What was a nursing home, that's mostly old folks, right, doing with a children's ward? I don't know, but there's no doubt that's what it was. There were faded old pictures of disabled children up on the walls, some with name tags underneath them. Like, yeah, they were incredibly worn out, but almost every single one had a crutch or a wheelchair or leg brace in it. But that just kind of made me sad. And the thing that freaked me out most was finding a room full of their old drawings. I think someone must have come along before me, recently I mean, found a folder of them and then just emptied it out onto the floor. But one room was literally plastered in them, and they were some of the most disturbing artworks I'd ever seen in my life. Seriously, even though some of them were just scribbles, they looked like something Charlie Manson might have drawn. Twisted figures and other things that just made me feel on edge just from looking at it. That and the fact that this area had a draft or something, so every so often the door would slam on a windy day and scare the life out of me in the process. The one time I tried to take someone else, they freaked out and refused to go back into the children's area, and honestly, I don't blame them. And on the way back, they pretty much nailed how I felt about the place by saying, it just doesn't feel right in there. This all happened back when I was in 10th grade and I was staying with my aunt and uncle in the country. They lived out on a ranch, so sometimes me and my cousins would take their 4-wheelers out into the trails to do some exploring. One time, we came across this old wooden bridge and jumped off the 4-wheelers to soak up the scene. It was honestly amazing. Even an uncouth little thug like me had to admit how beautiful it was. I'm talking warm afternoon sun, bird song, the rush of water down the river. To say it was picturesque would be the understatement of the century. Then, all of a sudden, one of us spots this metal wire that had been tied to one part of the bridge. Curiosity got the better of us, so we decided to give it a tug and see what the deal was. Right away, we can feel the weight attached to it, so it's obvious that it's tied to something that's submerged under the water. It took 2 of us pulling at once to drag the thing up, but when we do, we realize the wire is tied to a deer skull. A pretty big one too, and it was only half rotten. We didn't even pull it all the way up, and we could see all the creepy crawlies living off its decomposing flesh. It was legitimately one of the most horrifying things I'd ever seen. Then I just hear one of my cousins shouting, "Yo, look!" We turn to see what looks like an axe stuck in the middle of a tree stump down by the river. We walk to the end of the bridge and hike our way down to the river, and lo and behold, this is not an axe. It was a deer's leg that had been chopped off and stuck in the dead center of the tree stump, pointing straight up at the sky. I'd never seen anything like that before, and to say it put the fear of God into me would be a whole nother understatement. We rushed back to the top of the bridge and decided that there was no way a deer died by itself and put its leg in a tree stump and tied its skull to a metal wire. So it wasn't long before one of my cousins realized that someone was hunting out of season. Then, right as two of my cousins are discussing whether to take the head with them or not, they thought it was super cool, but it smelled absolutely revolting. We see some hillbilly-looking guys appear through the trees on the ridgeline above us. Then, right when they see us, they shout something before running off, presumably to make it down the ridge to chase us off. Wouldn't bother me usually, but these guys had rifles slung over their shoulders. We never rode our four-wheeler so fast, and we booked it out of there. We made it back to the ranch and told the grown-ups about it, who swiftly got in touch with the local park service. I've definitely had more dangerous things happen to me, but honestly, finding that skull and especially the leg, I thought I'd stumble into the middle of a wrong turn movie or something, or that we'd found some evil satanic cult out there in the woods. Just childish fears, to be fair, but at the same time, we'd have definitely been in for a rough ride if those hillbillies got their hands on us, especially after they witnessed us trying to steal their trophy. We're going back at least 10 years for this one, but me and my old URBEX crew were exploring an old abandoned hotel at like 2 a.m. one night. It was Christmas night, the one time of the year where almost every toad in the country is free to be cracked because almost every Seca is at home with their families. It's a guaranteed Christmas present for every URBEX nut in the Western world, and some of the best shots I've ever taken have been around the holidays. Anyway, the hotel's owners were having some serious squatter troubles, so they'd hired tons of security and put razor wire and vandal grease up everywhere. It was way too rough and not to crack, but Christmas gave us the opportunity we needed to get inside. I got my jeans snagged on the wire a few times, but it was all good, so we kept moving until I got caught on one set of razor wire and ended up falling awkwardly while climbing over a wall. I didn't think I'd done too much damage at first. It just looked like it shredded my pant leg above the knee. But then, sure enough, I reach under the denim and my fingers come back with blood on them. I felt kinda cool at first, to be honest. Before I knew the extent of the injury, of course, and kinda proud of myself that I got my first URBEX wound. People were always showing off bruises or the scars they'd picked up while cracking more prestigious toads. I know it sounds dumb, but I was always kinda jealous. Hero shots are what it's all about, sure, but the wounds had a kind of honor about them, like they showed how tough you were. But I remember that feeling changed when my buddy shines his flashlight to see what the damage is, and one of the girls with us starts retching. A big patch of skin on my thigh was just completely shredded, and a scary amount of blood was leaking out of the cuts. Before I knew it, I could see blood dribbling down my sneaker from where it was running all the way down my leg. I wasn't feeling so proud of myself anymore. The damage was way worse than I thought, and for a second, I actually wondered if I was going to bleed to death. Especially when I saw my buddy freak out and rustling through his pack for his first aid kit. He looked terrified, and that only made me even more scared. My mind locked in this thought pattern of, I'm gonna die here. There's no way I can get out in time and no ambulance is getting in here. I remember panicking when I saw all my buddies had was this cheap first aid kit with nothing remotely suitable to cover the extent of the cuts. And if it wasn't for the quick thinking of another one of my friends, I honestly don't know what would have happened. I mean, I was legitimately feeling faint and lightheaded by the time he jumped into action, and whether that was from shock or just the nausea of seeing so much of my own blood, it definitely wasn't a good sign. He had this long-sleeve shirt on under a bunch of other layers, and he starts pulling off shirt after shirt before the long sleeve, and when that's off, he uses the sleeves to tie a tourniquet right around the top of my leg above the wound. It hurt, but it worked. The bleeding slowed, and I was still unconscious when the firefighters eventually broke their way inside the hotel, and they were able to get personnel to get me on a stretcher. My parents were just glad I was okay at first, and it was only when I was back home that they got mad and asked me what in God's name was I thinking. They didn't punish me, though. I guess they realized the scare of thinking I was dying or whatever was enough, and it honestly was. which was equal to the slap on the wrist we got for trespassing since there was some legal gray area the hotel owner was existing in using that razor wire, and since I got hurt on it, who knows where that would have ended up. I was always super careful when it came to URBEX after that, and we didn't go anywhere we deemed too risky again. Out where I grew up in North Carolina, there are all kinds of small abandoned mining towns dotted throughout the hills, and I made a habit of exploring them back when I was in my mid-20s. I didn't have too many creepy experiences in any of them. I mean, aside from the general air of morbid spookiness that you get while exploring an abandoned place. But there was this one time that I definitely got the chills from something I found. So, I'm walking through a patch of woods connecting two smaller settlements, when out of almost nowhere, I see this old VW Bug just totally abandoned, like it must have been sat there, rusting for 20, maybe 30 years. Most abandoned cars around here get stripped for parts before any tow truck arrives, but this thing looked untouched. Well, aside from the fact that one of the passenger doors was open, turning the old thing into a handy home for raccoons or other furry critters. With that in mind, I approach fairly cautiously, not wanting to get set upon by some vicious raccoon mama, but when I find it empty, I start rooting through the interior. I ended up finding a few old rolls of film, so I took those to try to get them developed or whatever, but aside from that, there wasn't much else of interest. The only thing that I did think was weird was that no one had shut the passenger door after abandoning it. I mean, I get that someone just wouldn't bother if they were ditching it, but I don't know. Something about it just didn't sit right with me. So I decided to play detective and started walking from point A, being the open door, to point B, which was like 100 meters out into the woods, just to see if I could find anything. Honestly, I wasn't expecting to find Jack, and I still think I might just be being a little overly paranoid or suspicious about it. But as I'm walking, I feel something hard underfoot. Then, after kicking away the dirt and pulling a wooden handle from the soil, I find an ice pack, half buried in the earth. The whole thing was giving me seriously bad vibes, so I called the license plate number into the cops, then took the rolls of old film to the Walmart to see if I could get them developed. No joy on the latter line of inquiry, but get this. The cops told me the VW belonged to a young couple that had gone missing in the area during the 70s. So I'd either found the car they ditched to avoid being found by whoever, or I'd stumbled across a murder scene. Maybe even handled the murder weapon too. It's all inconclusive, of course. I don't even think the cops were interested in investigating a 40-year-old missing persons case, but part of me wonders if I'd explored the area a little more, if I hadn't freaked out and gotten out of there. Would I have found their bodies too? This was only a few months back, but I was cruising around my hometown with my brother and a friend of ours when we decided to go visit this old industrial park on the other side of town. We were bored and the place had been abandoned for years, so we figured, why not, and drove over to check it out. I'm not huge into urban exploring or anything like that, but I've seen the place explored in a few YouTube videos that I looked up afterward, but no one has anything like the encounter we had. I think our first major mistake was walking in through the actual front gate, bold as brass. It was the obvious way in, and anyone keeping lookout would definitely be watching that area, so as we merrily traipsed down the road and onto the property, somebody had to have been watching us. Plus, it's the middle of the afternoon, so it's bright and sunny, not exactly the best conditions to go stealthing around an abandoned property. Anyway, we passed the silos and end up in the loading dock kind of area. Almost every square inch of the walls are covered in graffiti, so we wander around there for a minute just checking it out and taking pictures. Only, once we enter the building, there's a pitch-black hallway to our right, so we avoid that and stay in the loading area and go up to the second floor. My friend is walking ahead of us, so he takes the stairs up first, but When he gets to the top of them, he looks around, then rushes back down, telling us to go, 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 move back, move back. Only when we're at the bottom does he bother to tell us, I think I saw someone. So the whole way back to the main area, we're on edge, thinking someone is stalking us through the buildings. That's when we hear a voice out of nowhere like, I can see you. We bolted. It was seriously one of the scariest moments in my entire freaking life. Hearing that sing-song voice of someone who legitimately enjoys stalking us through the dark. My brother said he looked back as we were running back toward the front gate and swears he saw the dude who was stalking us standing in an open doorway. When he asked what he looked like, my brother said that he barely had any clothes on and looked like he had scars all over his body. But I honestly don't know if that was true. We were so scared we could barely agree on anything we saw or heard. We talked about going back with a few more people and better flashlights, but so far no one is that enthusiastic about it. So it looks like we won't be going back anytime soon. And I can't say I'm too upset about that either. In my hometown, there's this big old mansion hidden way in a cul-de-sac, the kind of place you end up never seeing unless you know it's there. It's a bit of a local landmark, being abandoned since just after World War II, so basically all anyone remembers of it was being a moldy old husk that no one has the heart to tear down. It's kind of sad that such a grand old place has fallen into disrepair, and even sadder that it was basically used as a giant bathroom by the less prestigious residents of our town. So one day, me and a friend decided to explore the place before it got demolished. We broke in during broad daylight and using a back window, and as you can probably guess, it was falling apart. Most of the windows and doors had been boarded up, and everything creaked when you stood on it, like it was almost like being in an old ship or something. We also found lots of evidence that various people had used it to squat over the years, including bank statements from 1992 that showed someone was obviously struggling with their finances. In another room, I found a kid's toy, but they didn't look old. In fact, they looked like someone had just been playing with them recently. There was barely any hint of dirt or dust on them. Then, in the kitchen, I found some empty cans of beans that looked relatively new. And in the pantry, there were pea-soaked sofa cushions someone had been using as a bed. This was when I started to get freaked out, because obviously someone had been there somewhat recently, and that's if they weren't somehow still there, hiding and watching us. And that's about the time we decided to just get out of there. But then in the last room before the end of the hall, literally the last place we looked before we got out of there, I heard movement coming from inside, and something almost sounding like a slapping sound. Me and my friend stopped dead. Then all of a sudden, a pair of filthy hands come out of the doorway, and a man began to pull himself across the threshold into the hall. He wasn't groaning. I can't think of a word, but it was far more aggressive than groaning. We just turned tail and ran, all the way down the stairs and back out the window we came in. Then once we were sure no one was following us, we slowed down and caught our breath. Now that I look back on it, I don't think the guy would have heard us. Not right away, anyway. He was probably just a squatter wanting to scare us off his digs. But dear God, dude, seeing those hands appear before he literally dragged himself on his belly into the hallway, it was like a well-shot, well-executed horror movie scene, and it stuck with me ever since. There's this old abandoned slaughterhouse outside my hometown that my friends and I used to go screw around in when we were teenagers. One day, I think it was about noon, we were wandering around the upstairs part when we heard people on the main floor below us talking. Obviously, realizing we weren't alone was very spooky, so we quieted down and looked for some cracks in the very old floorboards to try and spy on the people downstairs. That's when we see these three older guys, maybe 30s or 40s, and they're smoking out of what is clearly a meth ball. Then I feel a tap on my shoulder. It's my buddy mouthing out the words, "Lab, lab, lab," over and over, and it's only then that I realize just how much trouble we're in. Meth heads are crazy at the best of times, but if they think that someone just found their lab, they'll kill you, bury you, and sleep like a baby after a 72-hour binge. They won't think of you at all. Even the stuff they were talking about was nightmarish. Like one was talking about this girl that he was dating or something. At least he knew her pretty well, that was clear. And the second was talking about beating her up as a punishment for something, saying how she made him do it to her. It was actually chilling realizing how much trouble we were in. At that point, we had to stealth it out of there, solid snake style. Our lives actually might depend on it. But as I'm moving out and back to the car, I knocked over a pile of tiling or something which makes a ton of noise, giving us away. I just remember hearing, "What was that?" before we ran, jumping back into the car and telling our buddy to start the freaking car already. They were chasing us down as we drove away, dude. It was like a horror movie or something, chasing us down with our meth head speed and human skull grimaces. And I swear to God, I've never been that scared ever before in my life. Even all these years later, I can still see that guy perfectly in my mind's eye. I also have no doubt in my mind that if he'd have gotten his hands on us, he'd just killed us right there, just to keep his lab a secret. I think my proudest break was this really awesome abandoned Victorian-era mansion turned mental asylum. It was every part the creepy archetype, complete with a stone ballroom, indoor fountain, dry of course, huge staircase at the entrance that looked straight out of Resident Evil 1, a tower, patients' rooms, the whole spooky works. And what made it even better was that I had stumbled onto the place completely on accident after exploring a nearby building on a whim. Turned out it had connected to the mansion, and voila, personal URBEX discovery of a lifetime. Anyway, I've been exploring the place for at least an hour, maybe more, and I only had a few rooms left to explore and take pictures of. I walked into a big one on the top floor of the place, and the first thing I see is a sign that says something along the lines of, "Warning, extremely high levels of asbestos in this area. Respirators must be worn. If you've been exposed, go to nearby hospital's ER immediately." I immediately sprinted out of there, threw my clothes in the laundry first thing when I got home, and took a really, really long shower. I also never went urbexing again without having a P100 respirator in my pack, as there's a bunch of other air-related dangers that you never really think you have to worry about. I love to explore the abandoned Titan nuclear bases in Colorado. I've had a few really terrifying experiences down there too. First was when we were held up at gunpoint. While at the end of a really long dark tunnel, we saw a light at the other end. As to not scare anyone, we try to make our presence known when we see other explorers. We yelled down the tunnel and they yelled back telling us that they were coming to us. When they got there, they all had guns, 3 in total. One had a shotgun and the other 2 small pistols. They told us all to drop all of our gear, including lights and phones, and to step away. Not wanting to die in an abandoned silo, we complied. They took everything we had and slowly backed away, guns still drawn. I know the place pretty well because I go there a lot, but getting out in the pitch black was very, very nerve-wracking and dangerous. If it was anyone else but us, since we knew this place inside and out, they most likely would have seriously injured themselves or even died. I went down there alone once and only once. Adjacent to the circular silos are those circular rooms that are 3 stories with each floor connected by a ladder. Outside of one of the rooms was a bunch of water filling a tunnel. Something about this water was off. It It was much darker and seemed to be more still than any of the other water there. You would drop things in it, and through a greenish haze, see them ever so slowly sink to the bottom, sometimes just staying suspended above the ground by whatever nasty chemicals were in that water. Inside the room on the top floor was this huge demonic painting. It depicted a girl with her rib cage exposed and her organs falling out, forming the head of another girl below with arrows going through it. There were goat skulls and all sorts of creepy stuff. I went there alone just once. I sat in that room in the pitch black for about an hour and just listened to the silence. Nothing really happened, but I had never felt more hopeless, alone, or scared in my entire life. It was like I was the last person on Earth. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And if you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links down below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.